You're listening to Audiology. Support our work on Patreon and be sure to submit your requests for topics in the comments below. When the Emancipation Proclamation was signed in 1863, fewer than 1 in 10 African Americans lived in the Northeast or Midwest. But things started shifting in the years that followed, leading to a significant move to places like Kansas by 1880, prompting the U.S. Senate to look into the matter. Even by 1900, the vast majority of Black Americans, around 90%, still called the Southern states home. However, between 1910 and 1930, there was a big shift, with the African American population in the northern states growing by about 40%, largely flocking to major cities like Philadelphia, Detroit, Chicago, Cleveland, Baltimore, and New York City. This period saw tens of thousands of Black workers moving north to take up industrial jobs, including those with the Pennsylvania Railroad expansion. This movement was mainly urban-centered, attracting millions of European immigrants to these cities as well, which led to some tensions. Jobs and affordable housing were in short supply, leading to competition. The strife was particularly noticeable between ethnic Irish, who were trying to protect their newfound status and living areas, and the newcomers, including Black individuals and recent immigrants. As African Americans moved to the north and started working alongside white workers in factories, tensions began to rise, mainly due to concerns from white workers. The American Federation of Labor, known as the AFL, pushed for white and Black workers to be separated on the job. This stance led to peaceful protests, including walkouts against Black and white workers being on the same team. However, these calls for segregation soon led to violence. One of the most brutal incidents was the East St. Louis riot in Illinois in 1917, where between 40 and 200 people were killed, and over 6,000 African Americans lost their homes. In response, the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People organized a massive silent march in New York's Harlem, drawing over 10,000 Black men and women to protest the violence. After World War I ended, the tension didn't ease, and African American labor activists faced ongoing conflicts. The violence peaked in the late summer and autumn of 1919 during what's known as the Red Summer. This time saw severe rioting and clashes between Black and white Americans across several major cities, including Washington, D.C., Chicago, Omaha, Knoxville, Tennessee, and Elaine, Arkansas. The worst of these riots happened in Chicago, where the violence led to 38 deaths and 500 injuries. Over $250,000 in property was damaged, and more than 1,000 people were left without homes. The Red Summer highlighted the escalating racial tensions in the country, setting the stage for the Harlem Renaissance, an African American cultural boom in the 1920s. As violent racial confrontations reappeared in Chicago in the 1940s and in Detroit, along with other Northeast cities, as disputes over housing and job discrimination intensified. These events were part of a larger pattern of racial tension and conflict, reflecting the struggles of African Americans in the early 20th century. Many African Americans left the South due to severe problems like segregation, forced labor, racist violence, and a lack of good jobs. In fact, between 1882 and 1968, nearly 3,500 African Americans were lynched. They were also pushed out by a system where decent livelihoods were scarce. On the other side, the North attracted them with the promise of better jobs, especially during World War I, when labor was in short supply. Factories and industries such as steel, railroads, and automobiles needed thousands of workers, and with European immigration slowing down dramatically, dropping from 1.2 million in 1914 to just 300,000 the following year. Due to the war and other factors, these jobs became available. Companies even sent recruiters down south and offered perks like free travel and cheap housing to make the move more appealing. Additionally, jobs in the North paid much better, often twice as much as jobs in the South, where the economic situation was dismal. Sharecropping, agricultural downturns, pests ruining crops, and natural disasters only made life harder in the South. Beyond economic factors, the social environment was oppressive. African Americans had no political voice and were denied basic rights and opportunities, living under the harsh realities of Jim Crow laws. All these factors together motivated a massive migration of African Americans to northern cities, in search of a better life and greater freedoms. During the Great Migration, many people from the South headed to big cities seeking new opportunities. In the first phase of this movement, most migrants were drawn to a few key cities. New York and Chicago saw the highest numbers, with Philadelphia, St. Louis, Detroit, Kansas City, Pittsburgh, and Indianapolis also popular choices. As the migration continued, more cities, especially in the western part of the United States like Los Angeles, San Francisco, Oakland, Phoenix, Denver, Seattle, and Portland, began to attract large numbers of African Americans. There were patterns to where people moved. For example, a lot of people from Mississippi ended up in Chicago, while many from Virginia chose Philadelphia. These trends often depended on the geography. Cities nearest to the southern states attracted more migrants, such as those from Texas and Louisiana, moving to Los Angeles and San Francisco. When distances were similar, people tended to follow in the footsteps of those who had moved before them, a phenomenon known as chain migration. Interestingly, the migration wasn't just northward or westward. Some African Americans moved to industrial cities within the South, like Louisville, which played a crucial role in America's World War II efforts thanks to its booming defense industries. These industries, producing everything from synthetic rubber to military jeeps, had a high demand for workers. Initially, African Americans faced barriers to employment in these areas, but the labor shortage and the Fair Employment Practices Committee, established by Franklin D. Roosevelt, opened up these job opportunities. This migration wasn't just about moving. It was linked to employment opportunities in the defense industry, which surged during the war. By the war's peak, Louisville's defense industries were providing jobs to over 80,000 people. The migration patterns we see weren't random. A 2021 study highlighted the role of social networks, showing that if one African American moved from the South to a new county, on average, 1.9 additional black migrants followed the same path, showing the strong ties within these communities and how influential they were in shaping the migration patterns. When African Americans moved from the southern states up to the north, they found new ways to express their creativity. This movement, known as the Great Migration, led to the flourishing of cultural movements like the Harlem Renaissance and the Chicago Black Renaissance, energized not just by African Americans but also by Caribbean immigrants. In her Pulitzer Prize-winning book The Warmth of Other Suns, journalist Isabel Wilkerson puts it dramatically. The migration saw 6 million black Southerners moving out of the terror of Jim Crow to an uncertain existence in the North and Midwest. This transition wasn't just a change of scenery. It deeply influenced the arts. For instance, Jacob Lawrence, a young artist in New York, captured the challenges faced by these African American migrants, adapting to city life in his Migration series of paintings. First shown in 1941 at the Museum of Modern Art, Lawrence's work quickly catapulted him to fame as a key African American artist of his era. The Great Migration also left an indelible mark on music. Blues singers, for example, left the Mississippi Delta for Chicago, attempting to escape racial discrimination. Well-known artists like Muddy Waters, Chester Burnett, and Buddy Guy made this journey. Eddie Boyd, a renowned pianist from the Delta, shared with Living Blues magazine that moving to Chicago offered him a chance to escape racism and make something of his talent. He remarked, "It wasn't peaches and cream in Chicago, man, but it was a hell of a lot better than down there where I was born." The Great Migration significantly drained the rural black population in the South, leading to a noticeable shift in African American population growth in various parts of the region. It affected the demographics of many states, especially in the Deep South's Black Belt regions where cotton, which was previously the main cash crop, suffered due to the boll weevil infestation. For instance, in 1910, African Americans constituted the majority of the populations in South Carolina and Mississippi, and accounted for more than 40% in states like Georgia, Alabama, Louisiana, and Texas. However, by 1970, the only state where African Americans still made up more than 30% was Mississippi. James Gregory highlighted the disappearing Black Belt as a notable impact of the Great Migration. Specifically, Mississippi saw a decrease from about 56% in 1910 to 37% by 1970, Georgia from 45% to 26%, and South Carolina from 55% to 30%. This migration not only changed the South but also transformed the demographics and dynamics of cities in the Northeast, Midwest, and West. In 1900, only 740,000 African Americans lived outside the South. but by 1970 that number had dramatically increased to over 10.6 million, making up nearly half of the nation's total black population. This resulted in a significant cultural and political influence in big cities, where communities developed vital infrastructure, including jazz clubs, newspapers, and political organizations. Notably, before the Great Migration, cities like New York, Boston, Baltimore, Washington, D.C., and Philadelphia already had established black communities. However, from 1916 through 1918 alone, an estimated 400,000 African Americans left the South to fill industrial jobs in northern cities amid World War I labor shortages. This shift dramatically increased the black populations in several cities. Detroit's African American population rose from 6,000 in 1910 to 120,000 by the start of the Great Depression. Chicago's African American population surged from 278,000 to 813,000 between 1940 and 1960. Cleveland, Ohio is another example where the black population increased significantly, from 1.1% to 1.6%, before the migration to 4.3% by 1920. Other cities that saw substantial growth in their African American populations included Philadelphia, New York City, Baltimore, Pittsburgh, St. Louis, Omaha, and a range of second-tier industrial cities. This migration pattern was largely influenced by economic opportunities and the ability to join communities where relatives or friends had previously settled. It led to significant demographic shifts, not just in the population percentages, but also in the social and cultural landscapes of the receiving cities. After the Great Migration, African Americans with education found it easier to land jobs, leading to some upward mobility. However, they faced significant discrimination. The rapid influx of African Americans alongside urban European Americans, who were themselves often recent arrivals, sparked competition and resentment. This fear was particularly strong among those who had immigrated in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, worried about their job security and wages. African Americans made notable strides in industrial jobs, especially in steel, automobiles, shipbuilding, and meatpacking, from 1910 to 1920. The number of black industrial workers almost doubled. Post-Great Depression, further progress was seen as labor unions, notably within the Congress of Industrial Organizations, pushed for the end of job segregation, helping African Americans get skilled and supervisory positions. From 1940 to 1960, the number of African Americans in managerial and administrative roles, as well as in white-collar jobs, increased significantly. By 1960, the agricultural workforce was just a quarter of what it was in 1940. Despite facing job discrimination, African Americans maintained higher labor force participation rates than whites from 1890 to 1950, which contributed to a decrease in poverty rates among black families. Housing shortages affected both African American migrants and new European immigrants, leading to competition for substandard housing and segregation into overcrowded neighborhoods. Discriminatory lending practices and redlining hindered African Americans' ability to choose housing freely and get fair prices. The National Housing Act of 1934 exacerbated these issues by limiting loan accessibility in urban and African American areas. In Albany, New York, despite facing poor conditions and discrimination, African Americans found higher wages and better social services, with local organizations providing some support. And in Pittsburgh, despite racial discrimination and economic barriers, the African American population grew significantly. Many found well-paid, skilled jobs in steel mills, forming effective community responses and support networks. Historian Joe Trotter highlights the importance of family social networks and community discussions in the migration decisions to places like Western Pennsylvania, where debates in various community spaces shaped the move to the urban north. In cities such as Newark, New York, and Chicago, African Americans started to blend more into society. As they began living and working alongside European Americans, the distinctions between them began to blur. This era is significant because it represents the shift for many African Americans from being rural farmers to becoming city workers involved in industry. This move led to a cultural blossoming in places like Chicago and New York. Take Chicago's Bronzeville neighborhood, for instance, which earned the nickname Black Metropolis. Between 1924 and 1929, Bronzeville enjoyed its golden years. During this time, many local business owners were black. An important milestone was the creation of the first African-American Young Men's Christian Association in Bronzeville, which played a crucial role in helping new migrants secure jobs in Chicago. Bronzeville was uniquely positioned, surrounded by white neighborhoods to the north and east and industrial and immigrant areas to the south and west. This specific setting made it an excellent case study for examining the growth of an urban black community. In these urban settings, eating properly in clean, civilized places like homes or restaurants became a key indicator of one's respectability. Chicago locals, in particular, prided themselves on the integration seen in their restaurants, crediting their impeccable manners and sophisticated tastes. Despite moving to the cities, African-American migrants held on to many cultural and linguistic traits from the South. These differences led others already in the cities to view them as other, and stereotypes about black people during this era often stemmed from the migrants' rural cultural backgrounds, despite their new urban settings. The start of the Great Migration highlighted a complex contradiction in the American South's attitude towards race. Even though black individuals faced severe hostility and were discriminated against through the law, the economy of the South was largely built on their contributions, relying on them for inexpensive labor. They were considered crucial for economic growth. A politician from South Carolina captured this paradox by stating that the region had too many black people from a political standpoint, but from an industrial perspective, there was room for more. As the Great Migration began in the 1910s, the white leaders of the South did not appear worried. In fact, industrialists and cotton planters saw the outflow of surplus labor as a positive development. However, as more and more black individuals left, panic ensued. Southern elites feared that the loss of black workers would devastate the South's economy. Newspapers began to underscore the threat, and white employers expressed their fear of losing their workforce. In response, these employers started taking actions to retain their black workers by offering higher wages and, in few instances, opposing the harsh racial segregation laws known as Jim Crow. Yet as these efforts did not slow the migration, white Southerners, in collaboration with federal officials concerned about black nationalism, attempted to forcibly keep black individuals in the South. The Southern Metal Trades Association called for action to stop the migration. Some employers refused to cash checks that were assisting black individuals in moving to the North. Efforts were made to restrict black Americans' access to buses and trains, and agents were sent to northern cities to monitor wage levels and union activity. The media was pressured to emphasize the negative aspects of life in the North for black individuals. Local and federal authorities enacted laws and policies aimed at limiting black mobility, including ordinances and laws that required men to either work or join the army. Intimidation and violence were also employed to deter black individuals from leaving the South. These tactics were denounced by Secretary of Labor William B. Wilson as a breach of the natural right of workers to relocate freely. During a second wave of migration in the 1940s, there was less resistance from white Southerners, partly because the mechanization of agriculture in the late 1930s created another labor surplus. It is important to note that black Americans were not the only group moving north for better opportunities. After World War II, many poor whites from Appalachia and the upland South also migrated to the Midwest and Northeast in search of employment, in a movement known as the Hillbilly Highway. Thanks for watching. Share your thoughts in the comments and subscribe for more content.